Welcome to Bradford and Brooks with your host, Margie Bradford and Jim Brooks, live on WBRT here in downtown Bardstown. The show is sponsored by Springview Hospital in Lebanon. Thank you for listening to 97.1 FM, 1320 AM, and 94.9 FM in Lebanon. Bradford and Brooks, a civil discourse of discussion where community involvement is encouraged. Bradford and Brooks is on.
All right, good morning, Bardstown and Nelson County, and welcome to another edition of Bradford and Brooks. Jim Brooks and my co-host, Margie Bradford. Good morning, Margie.
Good morning, Jim.
Well, the rain has held off so far today. I was expecting a wet back porch when I left this morning, but I see a little sunshine still.
Well, I don't think you're going to be disappointed. I think later on you will have a little.
Well, I'll have to make sure I park in the garage. My leaky sunroof is usually my best weather judge. If my seat is wet, it rained. So anyway, well, we have a very special edition of Bradford and Brooks today. We have a very special studio guest with us, one of our first studio guests since the pandemic, Nelson County Schools Superintendent Wes Bradley. Good morning, Wes.
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on, and Wes is on today to talk about the community, the grade 6 through 12 community campus model that's been talked about, and I'm sure if you're on Facebook, you've probably seen parents talking about that, good or bad. So, but anyway, Wes is with us this morning to give us a little information about that, and of course, Wes. Now, you had a community meeting in Boston Monday night.
Yes.
And then you have one tonight at Bloomfield Elementary.
Yes.
And tomorrow night at New Haven School. Is that right?
That's right.
All right. And then you'll have meetings at the other schools next week, and the high schools the week after.
That's right.
I believe that's right.
And I think we also probably, a little bit of feedback we got from parents was possibly doing some Saturday morning discussions as well.
Go ahead.
Possibly doing some Saturday morning discussions as well, and allowing really for just, schedules of all parents to be able to learn more about it.
Right. Well, I think we're all kind of in the learning phase about it, and your presentations really are to try to bring parents and stakeholders up to speed on what this means, and this really isn't something that's going to happen immediately. It's really kind of a plan for the near future.
Yeah, I think as you think about the work we do in schools, there hasn't been radical change in the last 120 years in the way that school occurred, but we do expect over the next 10 to 20 for there to be more significant change. And a big part of our conversation with the community campus is about being proactive as we look towards the next 10 years. And my role as the superintendent in Nelson County is to be proactive. I also want to say, Jim and Margie, one thing that I've come to terms with over the past week is my imperfection in communication. And I think the communication we put out was really targeted towards community members like you and board members who are probably attending board meetings regularly and thinking about some of the challenges that we face in our schools and look to the next 10 years. And I really missed the mark is thinking about that book and that video and message working for parents and even staff. And I think it didn't take me long to figure that out, but I definitely learned that when you think about communication, you need to be more aware of audience, especially when you're thinking about even if it's long-term change, the short-term emotion around that. So I have to own that and really learn from that and think about what does it look like to inform and empower our parents and our staff over the next 4 or 5 weeks to allow them to feel more clarity around the intention and how that impacts their child or their work. And again, I have to own that. So we're excited to develop more clarity with our staff and with our parents in the weeks ahead through community discussions. We're also meeting with staff each day from 3:30 or 3:40 to 4:30 in different schools across our district, starting last week through next week. So just another layer there.
Okay.
Well, can we take us back to the beginning and tell us what was the impetus for this endeavor? So, what were the conditions that led you to develop this plan to begin with?
So, I started in 2018, and the conversation that year on the local planning committee, which is, just for the listeners, the local planning committee is, by law, the only way that facility funds in Kentucky can be used and presented before the board. So in 2018, I started, and we had to, by law, also that year, do a LPC, local planning committee.
Right.
During that first conversation, it started in early 2019. Our focus at the time was really just understanding our buildings and evaluating those buildings. We also started introductory conversations about what it could look like to allocate potential facility funding. To be frank, at that time, we had about $6 to $7 million in potential facility funding, and we weren't ready to move on anything. So the plan was relatively small, and I think since then, we've learned a lot. It's been, I would say at that point I had about, 1,000 hours doing the work in the district, and now we have 6,000 hours. Right, you learn a lot over the course of those hours, and I think in the same way, I have been in Nelson County for 10 years, which is about 20,000 hours, and I've continued to see forces play out that make us think a lot about what are the tensions that we face as a district that limit students, that limit our opportunities. So that's how it started, and I think that conversation in 2019 started other conversations around what we want for students, and we started to change the student experience in our high schools. So our high school student experience has changed radically since 2016-17. And a big part of that shift is where 90% of our seniors are now engaged in community-based learning, whether that is through one of our collaborative opportunities with our local industry, or whether that's through work-based learning with one of our 132 community partners. And we feel strongly about that work because it connects our students to people and places in their community where they're more likely to give back and contribute and live and work and grow in Nelson County. So that's really probably one of the major forces that allowed us to begin to see the need for a shift. And then the pandemic comes. And the pandemic probably accelerated our conversation more than anything because it allowed us to see further into the future and some of the challenges we could face through the potential expansion of choice and virtual learning. And you think about it, it's 2021. If we say next year possibly 4 or 5% of students are virtual learning in our high schools, hypothetically, what's that look like in 2030? And how do we proactively engage students in virtual learning in our schools so they know being connected to our schools is going to be really important to being connected to people. So there are 4 forces that we talk about in our family discussions, and one of them is around the choice in learning and how that's going to impact our schools. Additionally, we talk about community building and the importance of our schools being centers of learning for families and centers of really community, whether that's athletic organizations, whether that's resources that you can't find anywhere else. Our schools are going to continue to be that resource for so many of our families, and we want to be able to unite more people over periods of time there. So those 2 pieces, choice and learning, and the way we think about community, are continuing to shift. And the 2 other pieces are changing population of Nelson County. Our population of Nelson County continues to be more and more centralized. We know that our families are living more and more in the west and the north part of our county, as you can see with the expansion of US 31E, along with the expansion of 245 and the communities that are growing there at a faster rate than anywhere else in the county. Lastly, the last four, so we have choice in learning, the nature of community and community building. We have changing population, and then the last piece is the changing workforce. Mm-hmm. And the changing workforce is where we feel it's going to be even more important for Nelson Countyans to have an edge on the rest of Kentucky and really the rest of the country. In order for us to have that edge, our students need access to unique and specialized learning resources earlier, so that when they transition to work, which most of our kids will after high school, mm-hmm. or if they transition to college, that they have the upper hand and they're connected already to people, places, and purpose.
Well, I can tell you that workforce experience is more than just about learning. It's about learning life skills and social skills in a workplace setting, and those are things you can't really teach in a classroom. Those are things that kids have to learn. And I will tell you that my wife, after the meeting, she's like, well, after hearing what's going on, she said, well, I wish Elijah was younger, so he would have flourished in, I'm sure, one of the workplace mm-hmm. settings. Yep. Just to get that experience would be so valuable.
Yes.
So yeah.
And really the whole system, in order to do that, has to continue to evolve, mm-hmm. has to continue to grow. And this is a byproduct of that, but also it's a byproduct of having 6 places of learning right now. We have 6 places of secondary learning, 6 different campuses. And that is uniquely difficult for ensuring we have professionals in those places that are allowing for opportunities for students. It's also uniquely difficult for the learning resources to be in those places, mm-hmm. whether that's at our vocational school, whether that's in our computer labs, whether that's in the way we think about day-to-day learning. And that's also a part of this conversation as well. We know that the access in our schools is not equitable, and it will not be equitable unless we change the model.
All right. Wes, I've invited listeners to send text messages with their questions. Are you open right now?
Of course.
Taking some. All right. We have a question here just received. It says, has the board implemented a comprehensive long-range plan for Nelson County schools? And if so, is the middle school merger addressed? And if you haven't adopted a long-range plan, why not?
So, yeah, the long-range plan, if you go to ncspride.com. It's a part of our original visioning that started in 2018. It had some long-term goals that were centered around 2021, 2022. And while that website is intended for our staff, it is the place where you can also access the draft of the strategic plan that we started in 2018. Mm-hmm. And you'll see that while many of those things have come to life, there are a few of them that we didn't, because you learn a lot and you realize, okay, these are the priorities. Mm-hmm. And we're really at an inflection point around the future, and the conversation around facilities will really allow us to build the next 4 to 5 year plan. But I think if you look at that original 2018 plan, it is I think our original conversation. It's led us to today, and it really has. It's still got a year or two of work that's left in it, and it still continues to change. So,
all right, I've got another question, and about. So please be specific and tell us about what future careers or jobs that preparing 6th, 7th, and 8th graders for while they're in middle school. Yeah. Affect the layout of the district, and what advantages will be gained for bring the middle schools onto the community campus.
So we know that, just like you, Jim, most of us don't figure out our careers till later in life, right? We know that, and we don't expect our kids to be determining a career. Really, not only do we not ask them to determine it in middle school, we don't ask them to determine it in high school. What we want is for continued opportunities for growth. We want them to experience connections to people and places around our community and around the world, whether that's virtually or in person. And middle schools in particular, we know that career exploration is very, very introductory. So there may be a student that takes additional classes in a given area, whether that's in agriculture or business, because that's where their interests may lie. But we don't expect them to necessarily stick with that pathway for that whole period of time.
Sure.
In fact, the majority of their courses in middle school, especially in 6th grade, I think would be core content courses with a few electives. I think where we see the opportunity arising is the expansion of those offerings and electives, as well as student organizations like Beta Club, like FFA, like Future Business Leaders of America. Those things, being a part of those opportunities earlier, allows you to have a greater opportunity in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And we know that, and we've seen the inability to do some of those things with students just in a 2-year pattern, really, where they're looking at 9th and 10th grade.
Right.
And I think the other piece of this is, if you think about future careers, I think we recognize that most of our students that are graduating our high schools are not going to college, at least currently. While there may be 30 to 40% that are or want to pursue that route, we know most of our students are looking at opportunities either online, to work online, or to work as a part of our community. So we feel like this allows us to continue to evolve with our community and with the larger economies of Kentucky and beyond. So just as an example, as we think about students as they enter into high school, some of the work going on at our local airport, airplane mechanics, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, we know those are going to be high demand, and we were going to continue to invest in those fields. In the same way, we also recognize that what it looks like in 2030, we can't fully predict, but we know that high-tech jobs will continue to be high demand.
Right. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you before we go on was just a pretty simple question. Is there a deadline or a timeline for a final decision in this discussion?
No, there's no deadline. I think a local school board could essentially create their own deadline, but generally they don't, right? So I think in our original plan, we wanted these conversations to happen in the spring and summer, and we felt like at the end of the spring and summer we would have time to evaluate, discuss, and begin to put together more of a decision-making process.
Right.
And I think that's where we're at. So we did push back the LPC to the fall, August and September, because we knew it needed to be in a place where people felt comfortable to have a conversation. And honestly, right now, many people don't feel comfortable because of some of the pushback. Right. So. Right.
Well, I will tell you that when I was driving home from D.C. visiting my daughter on Monday, I started getting my phone started ringing, with people asking, is the Gazette going to cover the school board meeting? And I'm like thinking, well, if you're calling asking, I probably should, though I hadn't seen the agenda or hadn't paid attention to it. But anyway, some of the information I received early was that the board was going to take a vote on this, and I'm like, that didn't sound right. No. But I thought, well, I'll go and we'll see what's going on.
Yeah, no, I would say that best case scenario, if it was to be, if there was a timeline, I'd say you're looking at October or November for any decision to occur. So.
Well, it's a learning process for the board as well. I mean, having served on a board, I I kind of understand how that works.
Mm-hmm.
That you have to learn as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion left. This isn't, and I think the perception, Wes, is that this is a done deal.
Right.
You know, and that no matter what anybody says, that their input doesn't matter at this point. And from what I've observed, that's not the case at all.
Right. Yeah. Again, I think the major issue though was I'll take responsibility, my inability to understand some of the needs of parents in our original communication and how fast information moves. And I think that's just something that, I'm going to have to continue to strengthen, and we're doing that in these community discussions each night.
I think one of the concerns that I've heard also is that they feel that under this model that, parents will be less able to participate in school activities, after school, in school activities and after school activities, that right now they have that hometown connection. They live where the school is, and so they're able to more participate. But that with this centralized move, that they would lose opportunities for that participation.
Yeah, and I understand that. Concern. Just something to think about. Currently, I think most of the conversation around distance is going to be in the conversation with Bloomfield Middle School. In the same way, if we look at community of Bloomfield, it's been largely stable for the past 20 or 30 years. Population hasn't decreased around the county. It's continued to increase slowly. But 70% of the students that attend Bloomfield Middle School live closer to Thomas Nelson and Nelson County High. So that's part of the community discussions that we're having. We expect that to continue to increase because of the centralized growth. Additionally, at New Haven and Boston, I think the biggest challenge right now there is the programs, right? Allowing a program to be sustained with the number of students that are in those schools is uniquely difficult.
Right.
So in many ways, Jim and Margie, we've already started to address this issue. We've had to combine teams from Bloomfield and OKH. We've combined football teams, softball teams. Same in Southwest with Boston and New Haven. This has been something that's been going on for 10 to 15 years. And people recognize it, right? They recognize that, and I think that the other piece of it is Okeechobee Home Middle School, which is our second largest middle school, is still right in the center of town. So we're really talking about 3 schools in that conversation, and I think that most parents are going to see the trade-off in access to programs over the access to the extra 10 miles from Boston or New Haven, 10 to 50 miles to pick up the child, right? I think that, and that's the opportunity cost, right? It's like we access to this, it costs us this. We also, remember, we have transportation that we provide and we'll continue to provide for students that are engaged in those activities.
Well, would taking away the middle school part of that school community or those local communities, will that weaken or strengthen the elementary school? I mean, will that would taking away resources from there weaken that school so that it would be on the chopping block too, so to speak?
Yeah. So, we talk about this as well in our community discussion. We see that local community elementary schools being sustained at least for the next decade. I think it's hard to see past 2030 in terms of population. But assuming the population is relatively stable and continues to have some level of increase like we expect, we don't expect elementary schools to be impacted. We also know that elementary students and families will be less likely to do virtual learning. So we're committed to local community elementary schools across Nelson County for the next decade and hopefully beyond, because I think those are really key. And I think also in my conversations with New Haven and with Boston, which are the K-8 schools, they see it as a benefit to their elementary schools. their 4th and 5th graders who become leaders in that school community, and they feel like their teachers are excited about that possibility. That's been the feedback I've had the last week, knowing that, again, it's a very introductory conversation.
All right. We're talking about your question, Margie, about activities and distance. And of course, this is a ways away, but had a question about activity buses. Will those be a possibility? Or, I mean, I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, but I know activity buses have been possible in the past when my kids were at Bloomfield Middle.
Yeah, so I think this model demands it, and the reason it demands it is middle schoolers in general don't drive, right? Fewer and fewer kids are driving every year anyhow, and just based on the data, I'm not sure exactly why that is. When we were students, it was everybody wanted to drive as soon as possible. That's no longer the case, but I think it's going to demand it. We already have some activity buses occurring for special programs. They're very minimal this year in the pandemic, even more minimal. But we absolutely expect to expand that, and hopefully we're able to do that.
All right. I had another question focusing on student safety. I know you've talked about that. And again, it goes back to how are you going to protect my middle school from being exposed to the upper grades? And I would assume that school safety is school safety, and the school buildings are secure now. And will be in the future, even if there's a middle school wing at both of the high schools. Was that a correct assumption?
Yes, I think that's another part where I missed the boat. Was I didn't recognize. I think partly me being a high school, middle school teacher and principal, I missed the boat on elementary parent perception, and that's really just a blind spot for me, because I think those of us that have worked in middle and high schools recognize that safety is all a byproduct of the people in the building that care for kids and that ensure there are structures in place that students are safe. And, at the end of the day, that's about people coming together to ensure that there are literal school boundaries that exist, and that when students do transition over time to whether it's the cafeteria or the auditorium, that those spaces are on a schedule that allows those students to be with their cohort group, their age level, their grade level. And that's, Margie, I know in Bardstown schools, how long have those two schools been right next to each other across the...
Always.
Is that about 20? So Bardstown are about 25 yards away. And those students do walk across and attend some of those courses. So I say that to say 100 years of... in the city of Bardstown, we've had something similar to this, and obviously their focus as well would be on ensuring those boundaries and safety exist. So,
another question, if you don't mind, Wes. And you've mentioned about improvements at the two at Boston and New Haven Elementary School. I think New Haven's probably one of the oldest school buildings in the district. And I think. And I can tell you historically, there's always been a desire to either a new building or major renovation of that building. Is anything like that considered?
Yeah. So part of our facility plan vision would be a major remodel at New Haven School, as well as Cox's Creek Elementary. So both of those schools. So New Haven School is just a little over 50 years old, and Cox's Creek's approaching 30. And that 30-year mark really is, I think, a key indicator for modernization. And at New Haven, I think we see that there have been some ongoing projects over the last 50 years. In fact, it's been added on to or reconditioned twice, but this will be a more major renovation and modernization. And I think that of all of our communities, the smaller communities need those local elementary schools to be there and be strong. And New Haven is a great example of that. Family engagement, K through 5, is vital to that community and those students. And we see the same in all of our schools. I think the major difference, though, this is I think a key point back to changing population and the way we've districted, is at Bloomfield Elementary School, It's very similar in that there's 250 students there that are all really from that area. They're all from the Bloomfield Chaplain area, and the reality is, if we districted Bloomfield Middle School in the same way that we did Bloomfield Elementary School, there would only be 125 students there in 3 years. And that's something that we don't plan to do, but it's a reality as we think about geography and community.
And the population
And
trends.
the population trends, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I think the other piece of this is we all know that our community has a history. Like every part of our community has a history. And while we had 80 schools at the turn of the 20th century, so in 1900 we had 80 community schools. Some of our communities were impacted over those schools differently. So Bloomfield had a high school that was, I think, very successful. And as you guys know, when that transitioned just over 50 years ago, that was also a time of, I think, challenge in terms of some of these conversations.
Right.
The Bloomfield High School turned into the middle school. Bloomfield Middle School then closed. Eli Brown closed. They built the current Bloomfield Middle School just over 27 years ago, and Bloomfield Elementary School came just about 10 to 15 years after that. So I bring that up only to say other communities don't necessarily have that same story. And I think that story is an important part of, I think, why there is, I think, some conflict around this. So,
Wes, this isn't exactly part of the community campus, but I keep getting questions about the district cutting arts programs. Can you address that? Is that and there's some concern about, well, what about teaching, the level of teachers, number of teachers in the district to teach these things?
So I'll start. I think our commitment to the arts is not only is it stable, but it's growing. As you look at our work with Community Collab and embracing the local amphitheater, as well as collaboration with local arts leaders, I think that this model in particular, the community campus model, is in many ways about uniting people in a place for the arts. It's not just about the arts, but it's definitely going to allow our arts programs to expand and grow. And I think so as a district team, there has not been any decision over the past 3 years that I'm aware of, even after the past 10, where arts programs have been reduced. There may be local site-based decision-making teams that have chosen to change an art class for a STEM class, or change a this for a that, and that's largely due to their population and the choices that they make. But as far as I am aware, every one of our schools is committed to continue to have art programs in their schools. And I know there was some concern there recently at the board meeting, and again, that's a local site-based conversation that, from what I can tell, has been clarified at that local school.
Okay.
One of the questions that I've had posed to me was, what programs would those children be able to get that they cannot get where they are now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they're really, based on our analysis, you're going to have 2 to 3 times as many opportunities for programs, whether that's elective courses in middle school, whether that's advanced opportunities, or in some case, higher support remediation opportunities. Additionally, you're going to have more opportunities for student organizations, and that's both things like academic team and or FFA, as well as basketball and baseball. Right? All of those things, when we unite resources together under our current scale, we're able to do more of those things. So if you look at a student currently in a middle school, in Boston and New Haven, they may have 2 elective choices. At Bloomfield or OKH, they may have 10 to 15 elective choices. What we see under this model is far greater than that, because of centralizing professionals in a campus. As you know, Margie, professional teachers and educators across the state and the country. Those numbers have never been real high, and they've continued to tail off as we think about the demand for those jobs. And this is a part of that as well, right? We know that the future, we want to continue to be competitive in attracting and retaining great people. And we feel like this model is going to allow us to more effectively do that, because the programs will be there for them to lead. Currently, those programs are diluted.
Well, Wes, there's been some discussion about the impact of closing the Bloomfield Middle School on the local economy. What do we've seen, of course, my lifetime, I've seen lots of schools transition and into other uses after new buildings were built, or they transitioned to a new school.
Right.
What will be the district's discussion about, the future of Bloomfield Middle?
Yeah. So in terms of directly talking through this economic conversation on the city of Bloomfield, I have a story in Bloomfield as well. I lived in Bloomfield for part of my life when I was a senior in high school. My family lived there for the 13 years after, and I spent a lot of time there. Also grew up in Chaplin and Bloomfield. Spent many days eating pizza at Hometown and going to McZee's movies. You guys remember McZee's?
Yeah.
McZee's was the place. You go to McZee's and then you go to Hometown Pizza, and you basically have the best time you could have. There's also a little putt-putt golf there. And I think the Bloomfield community has continued to evolve in many ways. I think the renaissance of the downtown area over the past 10 years, it feels like, I don't know exactly when it started, but has been evident. And I think there's a continued vision for the future of Bloomfield based on my conversations with community leaders there that really does include that downtown area and beyond continuing to have that renaissance. And I would say that there's a couple pieces as you think about economic viability and school boards, and school in particular. As you think about our legislative mandate, we know that we want to provide highly productive citizens into our community. At the same time, we can't become politically involved in the economy in the same way. And let me explain what that looks like. If we became politically motivated on one part of our county's economy, then we would make decisions that potentially would create other inequities. So, for example, we could say that we want to build a high school and middle school in New Haven. So we could take our facility funds, build a high school and middle school in New Haven, and we could bus students there 20, 25, 30 miles away. And I use that example because I think it's important for people to know boards of education should not be motivated by local community economic politics, because if we did make decisions on the local politic of the economy, we would not be looking out for the entire county. So by the same token, if we were thinking about economies, it also begs the question of the economy in places like Deatsville, Samuels, and the local Bardstown area, where the population's expanding, but there's no school for them to attend.
Okay. Well, I know we're getting down to the wire, Wes, and we've been peppering you with questions. Any additional points that you would like to get across? I've got plenty of questions and more questions than time to answer them, I'm afraid. But
well, I think it's no hurry. We're not in a hurry. And I think that my original conversation with the board last week was not targeting the audiences of the parents and some of our staff. And I have to own that. I think that set us back in the conversation a little bit, at least in the short term. I think maybe in the long term it makes us even better. Right? It allows us to even have a better conversation. Sometimes you got to go backwards to go forwards in that. And I have to own that. But also, I think it's allowed people to start to shine a light on the conversation and the opportunities.
Right.
So we are excited to continue those discussions, and we're excited to really rethink about what is the future demand of us as a school district and a community.
All right, let's see, maybe I have time for another question. I want to thank the listeners because they've been peppering me with text message questions and some excellent questions too. Let's see. All right, let me look back up here. What about, let's see. Well, there's another questions about cuts at Bloomfield Elementary.
Yeah, so my conversation at Bloomfield Elementary, if there's a parent that is interested in that, I think my first starting point would be with the Bloomfield Elementary site base, because they're making those decisions. The district board only determines the number of students and the allocation they get for that.
Right.
So that's the Bloomfield conversation. I think too, we've had a lot of growth in Nelson County over the past few years. We've also had a lot of change, and the pandemic has created some unique circumstances for us. And I questioned quite a bit when to begin this conversation, and if the timing coming out of the pandemic was appropriate. And I can tell you that I felt like we've waited too long already, and waiting any longer was only going to further this issue and kick the can down the road. And that is why we've chose to start that conversation. So,
It's a time of change.
it is most certainly been a time of change.
So we might as well make the most of it.
Well, in my years covering school boards, I think change is a constant. And you always have to look ahead to see where you're going.
Well, if we're doing our jobs, we should be looking ahead. I think that is the issue, though, too, Jim. Is I'm going to reiterate this. I think in the world of government, many of our structures and institutions tend to work towards self-preservation. And self-preserving institutions have to be highly cognizant of the demands of the future, or they too will get left behind.
Right.
And will no longer be institutions.
All right. Superintendent Wes Bradley is our guest today, and you'll be having a community discussion at Bloomfield Middle School tonight at 5:30.
Bloomfield Elementary.
I'm sorry.
The reason we chose elementary because that's where the parents really would potentially their students would be there. We start with the elementary.
Right. I misspoke. Bloomfield Elementary at 5:30 this evening. Tomorrow night at 5:30 at New Haven School, and then next week, Monday, Cox's Creek Elementary at 5:30, and let's see, on Wednesday, Foster Heights, and then the following week on the 10th at Nelson County High School, and on the 12th. I think it's the 12th, isn't it? Thomas Nelson.
Yeah.
And that'll be the conclusion of this round of community.
Yeah, and then we plan to do, based on feedback, additional conversations. We want to give some space towards the end of the school year for schools to do their thing and give space for our teams to celebrate our students. This has been a historic year for everyone. We probably in March of 2020 thought this would be over, and
Right.
I think our teams of teachers across our community, our bus drivers, our cafe leaders, our team of over 600 have, I would say, performed as well as anybody in the state of Kentucky in terms of their commitment to showing up since August and doing what's needed for kids. And that's something that I think if you look at our schools, many of our schools have even grown during the pandemic. And while there may be one or two that had upset the apple cart around the arts program or this program over the last few weeks, what I can tell you is our schools are continuing to get better and will continue to grow beyond the pandemic.
All right. Well, Wes, thank you for your time today, coming in with us. All right. We need to take some commercial breaks, wrapping up our conversation with Superintendent Wes Bradley. Thanks again, Wes. And you're listening to Bradford and Brooks, and we'll be right back after these messages.